Welcome to the 2022 Learning Collaborative of Franklin and Grand Isle Counties. We're really grateful to have you here today. This is the fourth one in a series of four. Today we're going to be talking about trauma-informed communities from practice to policy. You can go to the next slide, Jen. So a little bit of a refresher on what a learning collaborative is. Learning collaboratives combine learning and social connectedness to provide both peer-to-peer and expert-to-peer learning through learning communities. Peer organizations come together to focus on a problem, explore that challenge, and co-create solutions. Because this process happens in our community, successes are shared and each site can adapt insights into their context. I was recently on a collective impact training, and the final speaker said the most important thing we can do right now is host places and spaces for shared learning and co-created opportunities for design. So I'm really grateful for everybody for joining today. I'm super grateful, as this is our last collaborative, learning collaborative, for the planning committee of this learning collaborative from the Regional Clinical Performance Council, who has continued to meet through many challenges to be able to offer this learning collaborative. We focused on reducing death by suicide and overdose, and those were the first two sessions. Last month, we had an opportunity to dive deeper into the connection and the links between community and clinical care, really looking at that word care and how we take care of each other and building a social network that really supports people no matter where they are at in their journey and no matter what it is that they need. And today I'm very, very excited that we're going to be talking about trauma-informed care, but not only in a clinical setting, but also at the community level. So go ahead, get to the next slide, Jen. When we started this learning collaborative, we asked participants what they thought the most important thing was and what they were looking forward to. And really one of the things that they repeatedly said was collaboration. So this is a word cloud from that. And the words that are larger are obviously from the things that come out over and over and over again. But hope, quality, progress, integration. So all of these words that really reflect what I feel is a new space that we're entering into as we re-emerge or emerge from COVID and the COVID pandemic, is really that opportunity to work together again and to work more intentionally in the goals that we want to establish for ourselves to improve the health of our population in our region. Go ahead to the next slide. This is just and I'm going to say this is all of the offerings that we provided since February. There is a website, and I'll put it in the chat, where all of the recordings from each one of the sessions, the larger group sessions, is available to anybody who wants to download them. It's on the NMC website. I encourage you, if you have not been able to attend any of the previous ones, or if you have colleagues that are interested in any of this work, to go into these and listen and learn from them. That we've had some really phenomenal presenters over the last 4 months, and we're really excited about what's happening in terms of those connections and the learning that we've been able to do together over the last 4 months, despite it being a virtual learning collaborative. And I know there's challenges with that. I'm very grateful not only for the team, the committee that worked together on this, but also to Jennifer Nauer, our incredible facilitator, who's been able to really, I think, in my mind, offer an opportunity for us to connect virtually on a Zoom platform, despite not being able to be together in the same room over the last 4 months. That was the intention when we first started coming back together and planning this learning collaborative. But COVID had other plans for us. So, but I'm grateful that we're able to do this. I'm grateful that you're able to participate. And I'm going to kick it off and send it over to Jennifer Nauer, our facilitator.
Time to start your day.
Sorry.
A reminder from somebody.
Alexa has no idea. Alexa, stop. Alexa has no idea that my day started hours ago.
That's
So
funny.
Jen, I'm going to send it to you so you can go through the agenda and do some housekeeping for everybody.
Yep, of course. Sorry about that. That is pretty amusing. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jen Nauer. Here's the agenda up on the screen. In short, we'll start with a presentation-based keynote speaker. There'll be plenty of opportunity for Q&A. Denise will go ahead and introduce your speaker in a moment. We'll have a 15-minute break at 10. This big chunk of time in the middle, 10:15, the tabletop rounds, that is a discussion-based whiteboard activity, a little bit like a harvest cafe. So several different group discussions that you'll get to visit at your own pace. It's a bit of a choose your own adventure section of the day. Brief break at 11:45, and then return to the large group for wrapping things up and synthesizing really the 4 sessions of the Learning Collaborative. So Denise, I do have a couple of logistics to cover before we introduce Krista.
Okay.
So let's see. This is going to be a full house today. We have over 80 people who have registered, and there's already 43 people in the room. That's fantastic. And I know on Zoom it can be a little tight and hard to connect with each other. So with that in mind, we have a couple of changes this time around that I think will help. One, good to know that sections of this meeting will be recorded and made available for folks who could not make it today. All the activity happening in this large breakout space is recorded. In the past Learning Collaboratives, I've curated the view that most of you are seeing by spotlighting speaker videos. But today I'll be less imposing and you get to choose your own view. So in Zoom, in the upper right corner, you get to choose gallery view or speaker view. And you should feel free to experiment. You can pin certain speakers if you want their videos to be larger. Really, nothing can go wrong. Worst thing that happens is you boot yourself out of the meeting and come back in. So please experiment to your comfort. In the small groups, particularly as we are not recording those sections, we encourage you to turn on your camera if you're in a space where it is comfortable to do so. Doesn't always make sense in this big room, but in the small rooms, I think it will help that conversational feel, again, to your comfort and whatever's appropriate given where you are. Small groups will take place after the 10 o'clock break, so don't worry so much about those controls just yet. And at this point, if you could update your virtual name tag to add the organization or a descriptor from where you hail, please do so. And the way you do that, for most of you, if you hover your mouse over your picture or your video frame, you've got 3 little dots and it will give you the option to rename. If you have technical questions, please post them in the chat. Denise, have I forgotten anything?
I don't think so. I think you covered everything we talked about.
I think so too. So without further ado, if you'd like to introduce Krista, then we can get started with the day.
Yes. I am very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Krista Goldstein-Cole to the May Learning Collaborative to share her knowledge and experience in building a trauma-informed community. Dr. Goldstein-Cole currently serves as Director of Research and Learning Initiatives for the ANSR Foundation and as Assistant Professor of Social Work at the University of Montana. Her work and research focus on developmental adversity, those traumas, adversities, and chronic stressors that are powerful enough to alter brains, bodies, and developmental trajectory. Krista previously held several positions that integrate developmental adversity, education, and public policy, including judicial education specialist at the Washington Administrative Office of the Courts, education director at the Washington State Family Policy Council, and policy advisor on human services and corrections at the Washington State Senate. She earned her doctorate of education in human development and learning from Harvard Graduate School of Education in 2020, where she was named a President Scholar. Krista's research interests include cradle to prison pipeline, the protective role of school connectedness on adult mental health, and the role of developmental adversity education and training in the transformation of individuals, communities, and institutions. For fun, Krista is currently learning the art of documentary filmmaking. I'm really grateful to have Krista join us today. It's been such a pleasure to get to know her over the last couple of months and work on this presentation and bringing her and her experience to our community. And I think we have a lot to learn from her, and I'm really excited about what she's going to share with you today. Krista.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Denise. No one has ever called me doctor before. I'm not quite sure what to make of that.
You need to own it, I think.
I tend to talk quickly, or so I've been told. So I'm just gonna say to the interpreters, if I'm too fast or slur my words together or whatever, you can let me know, or Jen know through the chat or whatever, and I'd be happy to slow down. I am very excited to be here with you today. I have been so impressed by the work that you're doing and the quality of the work that I've seen, and just the fact that you're brave enough to take on the toughest problems. You know, there are a lot of communities and a lot of states that aren't willing to take on suicide. They're not willing to take on the drug addiction in a non-punitive kind of way. And so it's wonderful to see that work. And my goal here is just to support you in continuing to build on what you have done so far. I do want to thank the planning team, because they did such a great job in helping me get ready and in just getting me here. I'm in a different time zone. It's very early where I'm at. So I'm very pleased and thankful that they got me here on time. Today, we're going to do 4 things together. And so from my perspective, this looks like what we're going to do together. I'm going to talk a little bit about community and that intersection between community and trauma. And then I'm going to talk about trauma. And then I'm going to talk about building a trauma-informed community. And then in your breakout rooms later in the day, you'll be thinking about what's next, given the state of the art and your context and your sphere of influence. So that's where we're headed. I want to start, though, just by talking about my lifelong connection to Vermont. My dad was in the Army. I was actually born in Europe, but every year that my dad was in the Army and we lived in the United States, we would go and visit my grandparents who lived in Western Pennsylvania. And that somewhere in that branch of the family was an Uncle Joe. And I didn't have much geographic continuity in my life, but every summer we would go to Western Pennsylvania, and then the girls, so my grandmother, my mother, my sister and I, we would get in the car and we would drive from Western Pennsylvania all the way across to Uncle Joe's cabin in Bar Harbor, Maine, or near Bar Harbor, Maine. And you know, I don't know if Uncle Joe was actually someone's uncle. I don't know if he was a family friend. I'm not quite clear about that. But what I do know is that he owned a sardine factory. And when we girls would go to Maine, we would eat sardines and club crackers with peanut butter pretty much for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's one of my strongest childhood memories. But along with that memory is traveling through Vermont and New Hampshire to get to Maine. And I remember very clearly that my Oma and my mother would always want to do 2 things. They would want to go antiquing, and they would want to eat maple sugar candy. And it was, you know, the greatest delicacy that could happen in our family. So, you know, to be fair, you know, it was the 70s, so there wasn't a Ben and Jerry's, and I'm pretty sure that if there had been Ben and Jerry's, that might have competed with the maple sugar candy, but it was, you know, a simpler time. And we reveled in it. And I still, like, for years and years, I didn't go back to Vermont. I never saw maple sugar candy, but every now and again it would come into my life and it would carry me back to these times of driving in sort of roadside hotels with very green grass and porch swings, and things that just were quite indelible memories for me. And I tell you this story because community can really be about a lot of things. In one dimension, community is about our feeling, that feeling of connection, about being welcomed and recognized, about having a role and having routines. In another dimension, community can really be about experience, our relationship to the place, our ability to know and navigate the cultural and social norms of that place, having a common history. And community can also be about the physicality of the place, the maple trees, the green grass, the roadside motels. And it can also be about the resources that we rely on to orient ourselves to where we are and who we're with, like the annual arrival of fresh maple sugar candy. All of those things together and separately get us to a place of understanding community. Community is also about the strength and trustworthiness of our relationships with each other. So that the Marshmallow Test was first performed in 1974, and it's been repeated many times with a lot of variation. And it's been really consistent and very predictive of future outcomes for all the marshmallow gobblers and the nibblers and the patient waiters and all the folks. But it turns out that it may not be attributable to this hypothesis of self-control. Self-control may just be a piece of it. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to tell you about a more recent update on the Marshmallow Test that happened in the 2010s. It was published in 2013. And the children in this experience were making an art project. They were, brought into the laboratory and they were going to make an art project. And they took all the crayons and they put them in a jar and put a tight lid on the jar and left it in the middle of the table and said, don't touch the crayons until an adult is returned. And if you do that, you'll have lots of new and improved and better art supplies that are newer. So all the children waited for the adult to return, but for half of the children, the adult returned without the promised art supplies and just said, sorry, I was wrong, we don't have them. And for the other half, the adult actually brought the promised art supplies. And then in the second round, the adults promised that they would bring new and better stickers in addition to those art supplies. And again, in the first group, the adults didn't bring the stickers, and in the second group, they did. So after the art projects were done, children were told that it was snack time, and they did the marshmallow test. So I'm going to ask you what you think happened for the kids in this updated experiment. And the way I'm going to ask you that is Jen is going to start a survey, and you can choose among these three answers. There was a huge difference between the groups that got the marshmallows or got the art supplies and didn't. There was a moderate difference between the group that got the art supplies and the group that didn't. And there was nominal or no difference between the groups. So just take a minute and answer. It looks like we've got about a dozen folks who've answered, and it's pretty neck to neck between huge and moderate, with a few folks saying nominal or no differences between the groups. So about halfway there. At this point, about half the respondents are saying that there were moderate differences. And about a third of respondents are saying that there were huge differences. Okay, we've got 34 respondents and 46 folks on, so I'll just give you a few more seconds. Okay. So, Jen, if we end the poll, will folks see the results? Is that how it works?
I think you should be able to see them now.
Oh, okay. So everyone sees what I see?
I believe so.
Okay, great. Okay, so it looks like this results have been pretty consistent throughout. There were about 14 of 37 said there were huge differences. 19 of 37 said there were moderate differences, and 4 of 37 said that there were no big differences between the group. So let me show you what actually happened. Let's see, I guess I need to close this. I'll show you what actually.
It may be, Krista, that everybody might need to like X out of their little text box, their poll, in order to see your screen again.
Okay.
So go ahead. It's just if you're still seeing participants, if you're still seeing the poll on your screen, you might just have to exit out manually. Go ahead, Krista.
There we go. It wasn't advancing, but now it is. We've caught up. We've caught up here. So here are the actual results. So on the left, where it says mean wait time, this tells you the difference between the groups. So the bar graph that's black, it are the kids who had those unreliable adults, the adults who didn't bring the art supplies. And you can see there that the average wait time was right around 3 minutes and 2 seconds. On the other hand, the kids who had reliable adults who brought the art supplies and who brought the stickers waited an average of 12 minutes and 2 seconds. Now, that isn't perfect measurement because they cut it off at 15 minutes, and there are some kids who may have waited longer, but given those conditions, what we see is that the kids who had reliable adults waited 4 times as long as the kids who didn't. And I think it's important to recall that this measurement of waiting is really strongly associated with things like academic performance and, getting into trouble, disciplinary trouble, and even juvenile justice kind of trouble that might be associated with impulse control issues. So then on the right, we see the proportion of the kids who were able to wait that amount of time. And again, the bar on the left, the black bar, is the kids who had unreliable results. And what you see there is about 10%, a little less than 10% of kids were able to wait the full 15 minutes, whereas more than 60% of the kids who had reliable adults were able to wait the full 15 minutes before they ate the marshmallow. So in that, we see that the relationship with the adults made a big difference in terms of the kids' impulse control, in terms of their ability to wait for that second marshmallow. This is what the researchers, Kidd, Palmieri, and Aslan, concluded. Young children's decision-making on the marshmallow task is moderated by beliefs about environmental reliability. Now, there are 2 big takeaways here for us today. The first is that the environment, that's the developmental context, matters to children in ways that are sometimes invisible to us as adults, or that we sometimes attribute to something else. And that includes how they make choices, how they behave, and frankly, how they develop in their psychosocial and physical realms. The second big takeaway here is that we as adults have to be conscientious about the context that we are creating, about whether that context, that community, is reliable for children, and whether we as a community come together in a way that transcends silos and other sources of being unreliable. So let me just talk for a minute about what it might look like for kids and their families who are trying to navigate our systems as they currently exist. And, you know, it's possible that in Vermont and in a community that's doing such important collaborative work together, it doesn't always look or feel like this. But for both children, youth, and families, and for the professionals who work with children, youth, and families, the systems can feel like this, right? Where the funding's in one puddle and hope is in some other puddle, and another kind of funding's in another puddle, and the systems are separated from each other. And we expect families to be able to navigate and sort of collect what they need from these different places, just like we expect professionals to be able to navigate the puddles of rules and policies and funding to get what they need as well. And then sometimes we layer over that competitive processes like grants, right, that can make it more complicated. So there are lots of ways in which this can feel and be unreliable for children and their caretakers. One is it's very hard to navigate, right? If we can't find our way through, that doesn't feel reliable to us. Secondly, it can be impossible to understand what is expected of us here. Where are we supposed to go? Which door are we supposed to go through? Who are we supposed to see? Can we make one appointment? Which information do you need about me? Funding and policy may not be sustainable, right? And so they can come and go and whole programs collapse, and that's unreliable. Importantly, professionals burn out under these circumstances. And so maybe my family has a professional that's really helpful to me, but that person leaves the field and that feels unreliable. And then many of our systems are built to exclude, right? Many of our economic systems in particular that are means tested are meant to exclude people so that they are less expensive. And so that means that the systems themselves from the very beginning come with many forms of judgment, and that can also make a relationship feel unreliable. So to me, it's no wonder that Michael Ungar, who's one of the leading international experts on resilience, says that having a navigator to help you make your way through resources in a culturally appropriate way is actually the foundation of resilience. So when we think about trauma-informed communities, I think about moving from this sort of system of mud puddles and little rivulets that run off from them to something that looks more like this, where we have a container where the trauma-informed community becomes the container for the traumas and the adversities, as well as for those systems of care. Now, when the word trauma-informed was originally coined, it was meant to be about how services themselves were provided inside of service systems. So we can have a mix of trauma-informed systems and not so trauma-informed systems, but they can be very siloed. And so what a trauma-informed community really does, or the way that I think about it, is that it helps us to hold all the systems of care together, to make them more visible, to be able to see them more clearly, to make the spaces in between them more permeable, and to make the system as a whole more reliable and kind and effective for everyone who needs it. So what we're going to do at this point is that we're going to stop here and do Q&A. And I'm going to stop sharing because I can't see anything except my own PowerPoint. And feel free to use your raise hand icon or to use the chat to ask your questions. And feel free to build on one another's questions.
So if you're looking for that raise hand feature, you can find it in two places. Jiggle your mouse over the screen and your toolbar will pop up across under the reactions tab. You can raise your hand, or you can move your mouse over your camera thumbnail. Any questions or comments for Krista so far?
Let me ask you a question then to get you talking a little bit with each other. Do you feel like where you are in your capacity, that you're more like mud puddles or more like a bucket? And I'll let you think about that, and we will ask Mary to unmute and show us herself and ask us your question.
Hi, Mary.
Hi. I guess one of the things I was thinking about, and I'll be honest, I was distracted by my cat jumping on me. So when you were talked about like that relationship and how navigators make a huge difference, where does the idea that our institutions don't actually fund success? So we have a huge housing shortage, and we talk about, oh, you know, you're somebody who will qualify for Section 8, but you know, there's like a 10-year wait, but we don't tell people that, and there's really no housing. Or we say, well, here's a food benefit, but it's not actually enough to feed someone, and then it's their fault for not having enough food somehow. Or, you know, we have a heat benefit that runs out 2 weeks before, 2 weeks after it's introduced. Like, how does that play into this? Because I know that sometimes I talk to people and I tell them how bad it is, and that, you know, hopefully we can navigate and do something to make it happen. But the reality is like waiting 10, 12 or your lifetime for housing is more normal than I ever want it to be.
Thank you for that. That's a beautiful question, Mary. And I think it's a really important question. And I think it's at the heart of tackling some of these issues, right? That many of these problems are bigger than we are. And I think one thing that trauma informed, when we get up to the level of trauma informed communities and we're operating at that level, we're able to be more honest about what is systemic or structural, as opposed to what's somebody doing a bad job, right? And I know when I first started learning about systems dynamics, that I was taught that when you start hearing shame and blame, those bad social workers, those bad teachers, those bad doctors, those bad, right? Whenever you start to hear that talk, it's an indicator that the system itself has structural barriers in it. And that invites us to a new kind of conversation. And I'm so glad that these are the things on your mind. And I imagine you'll be having these conversations for a long time. I do not have solutions for Section 8. I'm sorry.
No, but it's a nice illustration of some of the terrain that people are seeing and reckoning with, right? And you've got a comment in the chat about, you know, it depends, mostly puddles. Sometimes buckets are with holes. Sometimes there's smaller buckets or more secure buckets.
Yeah, exactly. And I know it probably sounds daunting to think about how it is that you like make the bucket happen, but we will be talking about some approaches to that. And I think you're already well on your way with many things, as we'll see as the day goes on. Let's see, we have a new comment here.
So from Heather Moore, a major challenge that I have seen is that the policies for schools differ from the policies for childcare and the policies for camps and the policies for you name it. It was so apparent during COVID when we all had different rules, but we were all supporting the same communities, which made it extremely hard to partner and move forward.
Yeah, I hear that. That's very frustrating. I think one thing that as a community, as counties, or even as a state, that you might think about as you move forward is to what degree do differences in funding sources drive those kinds of differences that you see on the ground? And is there anything that you can do in partnership and collaboration together? So like that's one way to think about that. Any comments that folks want to make or other questions building on what we've heard so far? Okay. Funding sources really tie our hands. Yeah. Oh, I long for a different world sometimes. But in the meantime, we will talk about, I will show you where we are in this process. I have to change my view. I'm not quite sure where I am.
What do you need, Krista?
I need to get back to my PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. So here's where we are now, moving forward. So we talked a little bit about community, and next we're going to talk a little bit about this intersection between community and trauma, and about trauma more generally. And
Krista?
again, yeah.
Do you want us to be seeing your PowerPoint right now?
Yeah, can you not see it?
No, we can't see it. You'll have to share your screen again, or I can share it for you if you want.
Sure. Can you share it for me?
Yep. If you keep talking, I'll pull it up and then get to the slide where you are.
I can do it. That's fine. Let's see. I don't know how I got so confused. Sorry, guys.
There's a lot going on.
Oh, there we go. I figured it out. You know, you would think 2 years into this that I would be better. Now, can you all see?
We can see it. And while you're orienting, another note for participants, if you're looking at your view and you still find that the PowerPoints are bigger than you'd like, there's a little bar between the PowerPoint and the screenshots that you can slide to the left or the right. And that way you'll see our faces bigger if you wish. Go ahead, Krista.
Okay, so the next thing that's going to happen here, Jen, is we're going to start this section with a survey like we did the last time around. And I'm going to ask you, given your context, and that means your role, your sphere of influence, the responsibilities that you have, what the heck does trauma mean to you? And there's some choices here. So it could mean an acute injury or an emergency needing medical attention. It could be experiencing or witnessing something that is quite horrific. It could be being a victim of violence. It could be child maltreatment, adverse childhood experiences, all of these, none of these, or something else entirely. So right now, 24 of 25 of you are saying it's all of these things. Okay. So 80% of you have answered, and 97% of those of you who have answered say it is all of these. So I think it's unlikely we're going to get a different kind of answer. So we'll go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So you can see that one person said experiencing or witnessing, and that is very often a definition of trauma that comes from mental health. That's the definition of trauma associated with PTSD. So, so it looks like you all are very well versed in the kind of trauma that we mean. And I'm gonna say that when we think about trauma, it is kind of complicated because, you know, medical doctors have a way of thinking about trauma, mental health professionals have a way of thinking about trauma. And I think that public health and substance abuse professionals are starting to have ways of thinking about trauma. But one thing that really got it into, got this idea of trauma into our sort of vernacular was the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And I understand that some of you have a good grounding in this and some of you might need a little bit of a refresher. So I'm going to go through this quickly. And again, for the interpreters, if I go too quickly, let me know. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences study was conducted as a collaboration between the Centers for Disease Control, where Dr. Robert Anda was the co-principal investigator, and the Kaiser Permanente Preventative Medicine section in San Diego, where Dr. Vincent Folletti was the co-principal investigator. It was actually a long-term study. It started in 1994 and it continued till 2018. And they looked at 10 forms of what they call adversity and household dysfunction, which included physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, having a substance abusing caregiver, having a depressed, mentally ill, or suicidal family member, witnessing domestic violence, and the measure for that was observing violence against the mother or the stepmother. It didn't ask questions about fathers or same-sex marriages, and parental divorce or separation, and finally having an incarcerated family member. And the way that this works is that each type of experience is considered to be an ACE, regardless of how many times it occurred. And so it leads to a possible ACE score of 10. So someone could have physical abuse and emotional neglect and have, a caregiver who's using opioids, and that would be an ACE count of 3. So the key finding from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study was the dose-response relationship. And that's what you see on the left. As the dose of health or disease agent like ACEs gets bigger, the number of health outcomes or poor health outcomes also gets bigger. That's the dose-response relationship. And they found a dose-response relationship in many key areas, including addiction. Addiction was both abusing legal and illegal substances, tobacco, and alcohol. And they found a dose-response relationship with early onset. So in other words, the higher the ACE score, the more adverse childhood experiences someone had experienced, the greater the likelihood that they would have early onset of using cigarettes, of using alcohol, and using other drugs as well. They found a dose-response relationship with many chronic diseases, especially system-wide diseases like immune system disorders, heart disorders, etc. With mental health disorders, including anxiety and depression, and with relational health. So that included things like having multiple divorces, having very risky sexual relationships, such as having multiple partners at a time or having 50 partners over the lifespan. And then financial health, which also included ability to retain a job, filing for bankruptcy, things like that. And so there is a very substantive relationship. As the number of adverse childhood experiences increases, you get more of these outcomes. And what we can do with epidemiological math is to figure out what's called the population attributable risk, like the percentage of a problem in the population that can ultimately be attributed to those ACEs. So let me just show you this. If we imagine, I used to say a ballroom full of 1,000 people, but if we imagined that we were on a Zoom platform with 1,000 people who looked something like the Kaiser Permanente CDC study, 330 of them would report having no ACEs at all. And one implication of that is that ACEs are very common, right? 510 of that 1,000 would have 1 to 3 adverse childhood experiences, and 160 would have 4 to 10. Now, one thing I want to say is that the folks who were in a study were clients of Kaiser Permanente, and this study has been replicated in other settings such as juvenile justice and among helping professions, and the numbers turn out to be a little bit different. Like inside of juvenile justice, that number of folks with 4 to 10 ACEs is much higher than it is in, it's like twice, 2.5 times as high as it is in this adult population. So context does matter, but the pattern holds both in terms of context and in terms of population. So you see an increase of probability for outcomes as the number of ACEs goes up. So let's just look for a minute at people with no ACEs. And let's just talk a little bit then about IV drug use and attempted suicide, because those are so important in your work. So you see among the people who have no ACEs, they've never had any of those 10 experiences, 1 in 480 will use IV drugs in their lifetime. And the questions about that were about ever tried. So these are only 1 in almost 500 people would ever try IV drugs, and 1 in 96 reported attempting suicide. When we move over to the folks that have 3 ACEs, this box in the middle, we see an incredible increase. We go from 1 in 480 to 1 in 43 using IV drugs, right? And we go from 1 in 96, about 1% of folks who had no ACEs ever attempt suicide, but 1 in 10 folks with 3 ACEs report having attempted suicide at some time in their life. And then we move over to 7+ ACEs, we see that we get, again, a third increase in IV drug use. 1 in 30 of those folks will have used IV drugs, and 1 in 5, so fully 20%, have attempted suicide. And so this becomes a profoundly important indicator of how much these problem behaviors are being driven by, or these outcomes are being driven by, the experience of having these 10 adversities in childhood. So I know, for example, if we just take depression and anxiety, that nearly at the population level, we know that nearly 2/3 of lifetime depression is attributable to the adverse childhood experiences score. So I like to bring this together with this term developmental adversity. So developmental adversity is those traumas, those adversities like adverse childhood experiences. So some adverse childhood experiences rise to the level of trauma, and some might be more like adversities and serious stressors. So any of those things, traumas, adversities, serious stressors that are sufficient enough to alter our brains, bodies, and the developmental trajectory. And because human development builds on prior developmental outcomes, developmental adversity in childhood tends to exert greater influence than later experiences. But we do need to recognize that there are some traumas and adversities that can occur in adulthood or later in life that really can change the direction of people's lives. So I want to talk now, I want to turn a little bit of attention to this idea of altering brains, bodies, and the developmental trajectory. We could talk about each of these things for days, and some of you may have been lucky enough to do that. But in the meantime, we'll just go through it quickly. So there is a lot of, this is a picture of an fMRI that is tracking actually fiber strands in the brain, and our capacity to look inside of the brain has gotten to the point that we can look at this level. And so there are a number of researchers who are really examining the question of how does maltreatment affect the brain, and that's sort of been divided into two areas of research. So on the one hand, folks like Bruce Perry and Charles Nelson are looking at what they call deprivation, which we might otherwise call neglect. And it means children being deprived of those stimuli like language and touch that are necessary for developmentally dependent or experience-dependent development to occur. And then other folks are looking at maltreatment, so physical, sexual, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, etc. And there are a number of studies that have found changes in brain volume, changes in functionality, and the newest technologies allow us to look at how the networks inside the brain actually form. In most cases, the studies indicate that we see a loss in brain volume associated with maltreatment. But interestingly, the amygdala, which is the fear center, actually gains mass and efficiency the more adversity and chronic stress that we are exposed to. So experiencing fear actually makes us better at experiencing fear in the future. A second way that these developmental adversities, gets under the skin is actually through our genes. And every time I think about this or talk about it, it just blows my mind. This is actually a representation of DNA. And what happens with our DNA is that it will fold and unfold itself. Those curls that we see in the middle are strands of genes, and they fold and unfold themselves for two purposes. One is so that the cell itself becomes differentiated, right? Because, our teeth do not look like our eyeballs, and they certainly don't look like our heart or our liver, right? And so that means that we've got the cell differentiation going on. And we've known about that for a really long time, but our thought used to be that it stopped at birth, right? Like your cells all got differentiated before you were born. But the truth is that that's not what actually happens. For example, cancer is what happens when that system of cell differentiation breaks down, right? But what can also happen is that when the folding and unfolding of the DNA occurs, there can be changes in which individual genes are activated. And there is increasingly good evidence that ties developmental adversity with epigenetic changes. And we see there's a lot of mouse studies. This is a hard study to do on humans, although we are starting to develop the methods to do it. We've seen it in mouse studies, but there are also these very interesting cadaver studies that are being conducted up in Toronto, where they're looking at a specific part of the brain, the hippocampus, which in people who have died by suicide and people who have not died by suicide, and then they're overlaying history of adversity on top of that, and they're finding that there are very specific genes that are different in the hippocampus between folks who died by suicide and those who did not. So this is like very leading edge science. And it's also one of those things, I am really a social scientist, and I am aware when we get to epigenetics of my limits in biological science. But this is one thing I know for sure is that developmental adversity, one way it gets into under our skin and really gets biologically embedded so that it can change our developmental trajectory, is that it can turn on and off our genes. And then this is a slide that's more about developmental trajectories. And I think that I'm going to tie back here to the Marshmallow Test, because self-control is one of those things, or self-regulation is one of those psychosocial traits that develops over time. We heard in the video that ability to delay gratification, for example, is something that starts to emerge in kindergarten, right? And then they see these results where kids who can't wait for the marshmallow end up having more difficulty in school and having lower test scores and those kinds of things, often entering into the juvenile justice system. And much of the attribution goes to self-control, though we already saw one way in which that might not be true. So here's a second way to look at it. So we start over here on the left with DA being developmental adversity. Didn't quite fit in that little teeny tiny arrow. So developmental adversity, and so an individual has some combination of traumas, adversities, and chronic stressors that leads to poor impulse control. And that is a very common outcome that we see across the literature. So when a child arrives at school and demonstrates poor impulse control, there are a couple of things that typically happen. And the two most common things that happen for those kids are segregated special education, meaning kids with behavioral and emotional difficulties are less likely to be included or mainstreamed and more likely to be sent to separate rooms with other kids just like them who are having difficulty with their behavior. And the second thing that happens is that there's a lot of discipline that occurs, ultimately resulting in suspension. And over the years, we see this churn where segregated special education and suspension are both strongly associated with entry, with truancy and entry into the juvenile justice system. And there's just this churn that keeps happening that ultimately ends up in alternative school and finishes with folks being out of school, either because they choose to drop out or because they are pushed out. And then that combination of risk factors is most likely is commonly associated with prison. So if you walk into a prison, as I have had the privilege to do, and ask people about these experiences, you will find that prison is full of people who followed this developmental trajectory. And of course, there are folks who have lots and lots and lots of folks who have strong histories of developmental adversity who don't end up in prison. But the trajectory into prison looks a lot like this. And that comes from a lot of sources of research, one of them being my own. So our big takeaway here is that trauma in our systems like school and juvenile detention and prisons tend to get interrelated as the psychosocial patterns of development are disrupted. So I'm going to stop here again for questions. And again, let's, use the chat box, use your hands, and we'll just take a couple minutes here.
Krista, there was a question in the chat about expanding the questions of ACEs, the ones that the 10 about, hang on, I'm not looking at it right now, but about really about the structures of family, maybe to be, i.e. addition of diverse family structures. And I know that study, started a long time ago. Has there been any look at the 10 ACEs and whether or not they're looking to change those?
So that is a really important question and a very hot topic. A very hot topic. So, whenever you do a research study, you have to get focused on what's the question here. So when Anda and Folletti started this study, I mean, this is really hard to imagine, but in 1994, there had been 0 actual studies on these problems co-occurring. But any of you who work in child welfare, any of you who are police, any of you who work in the juvenile justice system, judges, y'all know that somebody comes into your courtroom and you've got child abuse and you've got domestic violence and you've got substance abuse all co-occurring in the same family. And until 1994, no one had studied that. So, the goal of the ACEs study was to look inside the household and to figure out what happened, to what degree multiple adversities were occurring. If you know Rob, he'll say, I had no idea. I thought there was some co-occurring, but I never thought I'd see what I did. So since that time, people have started asking questions about things like historical trauma, about racial discrimination. There's a lovely article by Garcia Cole about the role of racial discrimination. People looking at exposure to community violence. And there is a tendency to call all of those things ACEs, and I think writ large we probably can. From a research perspective, I have some qualms about doing that. And the one thing that I would encourage you to think about as a community as you move forward is it's very easy to sort of choose other adversities, like poverty is very common, racism is very common, and to shut the conversation down and to say, we've got to solve racism or we have to solve poverty before we can really tackle these problems. And I think a lot of that is because it's very uncomfortable to talk about abuse. It's very uncomfortable to talk about neglect. And so it's easier to reach to those things that maybe we could solve with changes in funding and money, and not things that really require us to think about human behavior and how we relate to each other. That it's a really important question, and there's been a lot of work done, and so that's just my opinion about it. And I think just being careful when you're conversing with each other, finding your own language. I think developmental adversity is sort of emerging as a term so that it includes ACEs, but it also includes other chronic stressors and traumas that might not be in those categories, that might occur outside the home or inside school or in those other places.
Krista, you have a couple of questions popping up in the chat. Do you have time to take them?
Yeah. To what extent is there research on organizations working to overlay trauma-informed lens in workplace? So Connie, that's a great question. There is a lot there. I would refer you specifically to Sandra Bloom's work. So the sanctuary model is specifically about that issue. And that's where I would send you on that question. Have there been talk about specific ways to counteract the impact of high ACE scores on individuals early in their lives? Okay, so Michelle, this is also, you guys are great at like the toughest questions. So yeah, there are lots of people who are thinking about early childhood and there's great work, for example, by Chris Blodgett with kids on entry into K-12. So with kindergartners, first and second graders, that found that kids, and they had to use indicators because it's very complex to ask children about their ACEs because you have to get the parents' consent. So you have to say, hey, we're studying abuse. We're going to ask your kid if you abuse them, and we're mandatory reporters. So if you do, we're going to report you to the authorities. Like, it doesn't work very well as a research model. So what Chris Blodgett has done is he's used the clues that are available in school systems. So for example, if you work in schools, you'll know this. If you don't, you might not. Schools are contacted when there are protection orders in place because schools are responsible to enforce those orders when kids are in their care. So that means that a school is going to be aware when there's severe domestic violence in a home. So Chris Blodgett used those kind of indicators to measure ACEs, and he found even in kindergarten, you had really high levels of excessive absenteeism, so either truancy or being gone a lot because of chronic illness at home in the parent generation, or chronic illness in the child generation, or issues of neglect, those kinds of things. But one of the cautions we need to take here is that ACE scores go until age 18, and they have really big impact. So some of the brain work that's been done, particularly by Marty Teicher, demonstrates that timing matters really a lot. And there are many things that happen, that can happen with respect to brain development, even at age 9, 10, 11, 12, when there's maltreatment at home. And actually, one of the most interesting things is that we see a huge spike in both emotional abuse and physical neglect in the teenage years. And that's using a tool called the MACE, which is designed specifically to look at maltreatment by age. So yeah, there's lots to unpack here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. We've only got about 20 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we are able to get all the way through this case study I brought for you. Okay, I'm having this issue where it doesn't want to advance for me when I come back. So I am sharing, right, Jen? You can see?
Yep, I can see. If you click on your, there you go.
It just needed a minute. So we're here in number 3, the trauma-informed community piece. We'll be bringing some new things in and then wrapping up with old things. So if we don't want to see that last slide that I showed you with that developmental trajectory into prison, is not really our desired outcome, right? So what is our desired outcome? Our desired outcome is that we reduce adversity. We want to be reducing those adversities. But once adversity happens, what we see is adaptation. And adaptation is a larger word to think about those ways that the brain and the body take in, and the socio-cultural and psychosocial development occurs. And so those adaptations occur. And what happens is we want to see a supportive societal response to those things, right? So instead of saying, oh, here's a kid with poor impulse control, we're going to isolate him from the rest of his peers and send him to segregated special education where he doesn't get to see any sort of age normative behaviors, and we're going to just keep disciplining him out of school, that we have a more positive social response, which may include supports for those parents, supports for those teachers, resources for those teachers, etc., that results in flourishing. And then as we go around this positive feedback loop, we get reductions in adversity in the next generation, right? Because just as in case this isn't obvious, if you have someone whose developmental trajectory is segregated special education, truancy, suspension, juvenile justice, prison, then they are bringing to their own children at least one ACE, and that is having an incarcerated family member. And for those of you who don't know, about 20% of kids who are in the juvenile justice system are already parenting. And more than 50% of men in prison are parenting, and more than 90% of women in prison are parenting. So this helps, this idea of having supportive social responses, which is what we get in a trauma-informed community, right? But how the heck do you do that? This is an empirically tested model for getting to what Porter, Martin, and Anda call self-healing communities, which we might also call trauma-informed communities. So the key elements are expanding leadership, so inviting more people in to and welcoming people who have life experience into the process of figuring out what to do about these problems. Focus, which has to do with coming to really understand the trauma and biological embedding and all of those kinds of things, and then learning together about what's happening here. What are the dynamics inside of our systems, our community, our population's experience that are producing the results that we currently have, and then trying things and learning from them. So these three things over here, leadership, expansion, focus, and learning, are part of the learning collaborative definition that Denise shared with us at the very beginning. And what we would add here is this results focus. And this is specifically about building feedback loops about those learning efforts. What's changing, for whom, how? Are we seeing results? Are we doing something in the school silo but getting results in the juvenile justice silo? Being able to see and figure out what's happening in the system as a whole, which does definitely infer that there are some data skills that we need to have present. I have here another Q&A, but I'm not quite sure. It feels a little soon for the Q&A. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn to this case study to give you an empirical example of how this might work. And the community that I'm going to talk about is called Greater Pearce County, Washington. And as this picture implies, Greater Pearce has an incredible mix of urban and rural. So Mount Rainier is in fact in Pearce County, but so is Tacoma, Washington, which is the second largest city in the state. So this group that was doing this work was called the Greater Pearce Community Network. And so its boundaries were everything in Pearce County except the Tacoma School District. So it excluded that big urban area that was Tacoma, and then it was everything else. So all of the cities like Puyallup, for example, but also very rural areas like Mount Rainier. So the community network, the official name for community networks by statute is Community Public Health and Safety Networks. They're authorized by statute in the state of Washington, and they comprise a quasi-governmental special purpose district with no taxing authority. And the statute requires membership of 23 board members, and more than 50% have to be non-fiduciary. And that means that the members of the board can't make their living, being educators, being health and service providers, healthcare providers, etc. And the idea there was it helps us to expand the leadership. It gets us out to the folks who have lived experience of trying to navigate these systems, lived experiences with unnoticed adversities with various outcomes. But it also acknowledges that, developmental adversities do show up in our formal systems, in our schools, in our healthcare, in our mental health system, in our substance abuse treatment. And so each community network, and to begin with, there were 53, but ultimately it settled down around 39 in 2001. And there were 7 problem behaviors defined in the law. So they were child abuse and neglect, youth violence, youth substance abuse, teen pregnancy, teen suicide, dropping out, and domestic violence. And each community that asked to be authorized as a quasi-governmental special purpose district had to address at least 2 of those 7 problem behaviors by reducing risk and increasing protective factors. And it's an outcome-focused system. So the required outcome is reducing the population rates of those 7 problem behaviors, which is very challenging. Funding was formulated using a base rate so that every community could hire at least a part-time staffer to help them, because partnership is nobody's job, right? It's something that people have to add to their jobs, plus a population formula. And then it was evaluated by learning. Communities had to demonstrate every 2 years that they were learning from their efforts. And it was values-driven system. And so it was a network. So Greater Pearce Community Networks was part of a statewide network of networks that were premised on partnership, innovation, tailoring to local culture and resources. So that's what the statute says. The statute is still in place. The funding went away as part of, as a consequence of the recession in 2009 and 2010. Washington State has no income tax, so that it lost 40% of its revenue during that recession. So this was one of the things, the funding was cut, but the authority's still on the books, so communities can still use the authority that they have to do these things. So I want to really talk about what Greater Pearce did. One of the things that they did, because they were really at the Greater Pearce was really at the heart of the meth crisis. And I'm sure that this probably occurs in your communities as well, that a lot of the making of methamphetamine occurred in rural places because it was just less detectable. And that means that Greater Pearce was particularly hard hit. And so as the meth challenge became more real, they worked to expand leadership, and they really reached to those rural geographies, tried to get a better sense of what's happening where you are. Why are these labs difficult to find? What is it like? Because they, if you just make a meth lab and then abandon it, you leave a hazardous waste dump behind. So they really reached into these communities to recruit not only professionals like sheriffs that were trying to deal with the meth labs, but also residents who were experiencing things like, my water is now polluted from the meth dump that got left up the hill, right? They really set their focus on the impact of the meth crisis on children. So they really wanted to understand what's happening to children. And they began to really learn that the system's dynamics included meth addiction manifesting as neglect. When parents are using meth, it is very difficult for them to be attentive parents, in part because there's so much drug seeking, in part because there is making of meth occurring, in part because the ways in which meth affects the brain, caring for kids gets lost. So it really manifested as neglect. And there was nothing about the special case of math that was in public policy with respect to what happens to kids. So this community decided that they might not be able to stop parents from using meth. They might not be able to completely stop the manufacture of meth, but they wanted to do harm reduction for those kids who were caught up in that crisis. And so they began to work towards the results of protecting kids. So in their first iteration, the first time they went around that self-healing community circle, they looked to getting new law. And the new law was meant to ensure that kids found in meth labs were removed from their homes and protected by the child welfare system. And one of the things that they found as part of that is that when kids have been exposed to the chemicals in a meth lab, it becomes very important to see what's happening to them physically, right? So they made a partnership with the Tacoma Children's Hospital, and Tacoma Children's Hospital developed medical protocols for how you assess and treat children exposed to chemicals that are commonly found in meth labs. And the children were removed and placed in the care of Child Protective Services. So that was great. It wasn't unexpected that the number of kids in care increased. That's what you would expect. But what they hadn't anticipated was that then there would be a foster care crisis, right? There were so many kids moving into foster care as a result of meth labs and they were now increasing the numbers by bringing kids into the foster care system when they were found in meth labs. So what do you do about that? So the next thing they did was they started a campaign to recruit foster care families. And they wanted to do it very carefully so that kids could stay in their own community. So they didn't also have to change schools, because that would just be one more disruption for those children. And so they recruited lots of foster families, enough foster families, in fact, that they were able to start offering some respite care to other foster families, right? But then you don't want kids to be in foster care forever, right? And so the system itself moves towards reunification with parents. So on the next iteration, they began to think about, well, what are we going to do about reunification? Because one thing that they heard from this expanded leadership that included people who had had to deal with meth addictions or other kinds of addiction is that parenting sober is really different from parenting when you're high. And that presents really a lot of challenges. And that may be something that's missing in our addiction treatment systems. Thinking about what does it mean to become a sober parent, not just a sober person. And so they got together as a community network, and they decided that what they should do is they built a facility called Phoebe House. And Phoebe House is for women who are exiting the combination of inpatient treatment and a sentence related to drugs in a supervised reunification environment. So the families come back together and live together at Phoebe House in a supervised environment that continues to provide sobriety support to the parents in that situation. And that is how they addressed this crisis. And it's really easy. Oh, look, I put it on one. It's on one PowerPoint slide. It must be, if not easy, at least very straightforward, right? No, not true. One of the things that's true is that they had to build capacities, right? They had to build a lot of capacities. So one kind of capacity that they had to build was clinical standards which they did in partnership with the Children's Hospital, right? They had to build all kinds of partnerships, not just with Children's, but in order to get Phoebe House built, for example, they had to have partners in doing that. They had to build feedback loops, like how did they discover that their policy to send more kids into foster care was creating a crisis in the child welfare system? They needed to build feedback loops of communication and data so that they could hear that message, right? They needed data to understand where the meth crises were, how many kids were entering into the child welfare system. Were they on track in terms of getting to where they wanted to go with the meth crisis, with reunifying kids, with having reunification last instead of re-entry into the system, those kinds of things. And importantly, they had to build civic engagement. These were community members who went to the legislature and asked the legislature to make a change in the definition of child neglect so that these children would be moved into child protective services. And you know, we don't all know how to do that. So they also had to build capacities around civic engagement. And all of those things, the capacities that they chose to build, became that container that holds their trauma-informed community, right? Now, there may be other traumas and adversities that they need to get more informed about, but for this particular bucket, they were able to build these capacities. So I think when we think about trauma-informed communities, the first thing I realize now that I'm just talking to a camera and can't see any of you, but I should have made a slide that said this, sorry.
And Krista, just a check on time, it's 10, so we don't want to miss this, what you're going to summarize here.
Okay, and
check.
are we supposed to stop at 10 or 10:10? No, I don't want to take your breakaway, sorry. Sorry, everyone. Let me just say that.
Oh, don't mind, Krista. I won't let you take the break away. We all get a break. I'm just going to bump other things as you take time. So as you wrap up into your summary, we'll just bump the break a bit later.
Okay. So, I think the big takeaways here in terms of trauma-informed community are, number one, that our children, to grow up healthy and safe, need a reliable environment. And one way that we can contribute to that reliable environment is by being trauma-informed. So that's one important takeaway. A second important takeaway is that when we invoke the word trauma, we also need to recognize that what happens as a developmental process is that that these things get under our skin. They affect our biology. They affect our health. They affect our behavior. So the root causes of many of the population problems we see, including opioid crisis and suicide, have many of their roots, not all, but many of their roots in trauma. And so we need to be thinking about trauma-informed communities as looking to those root causes, right? The third thing is that becoming trauma-informed is an iterative process. But the place that we want to get to, there are two places that we want to get to. One is that we want a community that is able to respond to adversities and its developmental sequelae in ways that are positive and supportive and not punitive. We want a positive social response in order to drive forward that positive development. And then the second thing that we really want is to build the capacities we need so that our community becomes more like a bucket that holds together all of the systems and helps them work together and helps them be a reliable place to navigate as we move forward. And of course, those things all take time. And so the last thing that I will leave you with is this idea of persistence, right? These are tough problems and they take time and they take persistence to solve. And many of our funding cycles and policy cycles aren't really set up for that. And so it does require building the capacity for persistence and innovation and creativity. So I'll stop there. And if you want to take a couple minutes for questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm also happy to set up a breakout room, Jen, and people could drop by during their breaks and I could answer questions.
We can do that. We have, I'm going to make an executive decision here, Krista.
Okay.
We get to have you with us for a little bit longer this morning, right? You're not leaving right away.
No.
So I think we'll shift to a break, and I'm going to reset those breakout rooms for the small groups.
Okay.
Folks, if you have questions for Krista, I'm thinking she's inviting knowing what's on your mind, and the chat might be a really good mechanism for that right now. Krista will be with us, and I think even dropping by some of those small group discussions for the next hour or so, right? So why don't we fit into the mix there, Krista?
Okay.
Are there any overall comments that anyone wants to take before the break or hear Krista speak to? We can pause there for a couple minutes. I just don't want you to feel like it's your last chance.
And feel free to run to your bio break if that is your preference.
Yeah, so true. Well, it might be that people need a break to integrate. There is a comment in the chat, and to the extent that it's you can use it as a reflection. It might take a really long time to actually answer it. But it's talking about the impact of culture on even the development of ACEs and how you think about capacity, right?
Yeah, let me just thank you so much for this, Chris. I really appreciate you raising this question, and I realize now that I didn't spend as much time and care as I meant to on this issue there are two sides of this. One is the side of becoming trauma informed and taking action. The other side is on the side of intergenerational and historical trauma. And it's critically important for me to acknowledge that in communities that have experienced ethnocide and genocide and enslavement and eugenics and ableism, that there is intergenerational trauma that has occurred there and historical trauma that has occurred there, and that is incredibly important to acknowledge, and our understanding of that is not as good as it will be. I know lots of folks are working on that. Some of the most wonderful Native folks that I know, Indigenous people that I know, are working on that relationship between historical trauma and current rates of adversities. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to acknowledge that. And my apologies for not acknowledging it earlier in the talk. And the second thing is that no, there's not very good much research about how community values impact the particular choices that people make, but that communities make in terms of how they move forward in a trauma-informed way. But I will say that part of what trauma-informed, even in its most narrow connotation, does suggest that we give the freedom and the empowerment for people to act in a way that's culturally appropriate for the community that they are part of, and to draw on those relationships in important ways. And some of the most beautiful work that I have seen done has been done in Indigenous communities.
So,
yeah.
right. So Krista, I imagine there are lots of thoughts in reaction to what you've just said, and I need to balance it with a need for a break and a need for time for small group conversations. So I'm a little hesitant about how to open up the floodgates here. We have two options. Krista, do you want to take a break and then come back, or is your invitation to talk with folks who might still want to speak with you still stand?
Yeah, my invitation still stands.
Then here's what I'll do. I'm going to set up a separate room and call it Krista.
Okay.
It will be open until the small groups begin, and then
Okay.
we'll all come back. Everyone, after the break, you can take a good 15 minutes for a stretch and a bio break. The concept of the exercise you're about to walk into is that overall, our systems are not as trauma informed as they could be. And so small group discussions are going to explore the various components, a lot of what you just listed, Krista, around feedback loops and data, civic engagement, persistence, what it would require to be trauma informed in principle and in practice. So you'll have a chance to do some of that detail work there. Let's come back as a large group at, trying to do math, 10:25. Does that give everyone 15 minutes? Those of you who do want to talk to Krista, I'll go ahead and set up a breakout room that's called Krista, and you can find her there. On your Zoom toolbar, click the 3 dots, and you'll be able to get to the breakout room once I open it. Okay, y'all?
Jen, when we come back, sorry, there'll be an opportunity for everybody to come back to this larger room, and then
Yes.
the 3 or the 5 questions that we've identified, and then people will self-select their own.
Yeah, I have some instruction to give you about how to
Okay.
navigate. So don't worry about jumping right into the activity. We'll see
Okay.
each other again first.
All right. So at 10:25, we'll all come back.
To this
And-
room. Yep.
But in the meantime, if you want to continue discussing anything with Krista, thank you, Krista. I just want to say that was really, you hit the nail on the head for me. So I'm hoping that other people felt the same way, but that was really fabulous.
Thank you.
All right, let's see how this goes. Oh, shoot, it just reset all the questions.
Uh-oh.
It's okay. Room 6 is going to be called Krista, and I will reset them during the break. All right, all. See you at 10:25.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you, Krista.
Krista, do you know how to get to the breakout room if you wish?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, all, welcome back. Let's talk about how this next activity will work. You may have questions even after these instructions, and if so, it's fine to ask. So again, the exercise overall is tabletop rounds. If we were in the same big room together, you would be visiting different stations around the room. Each station would have an easel sheet, markers, a discussion prompt, and a facilitator. And you would be able to wander to where the conversation was most relevant. In our virtual world, we're using breakout rooms, and each breakout room is stocked with a virtual whiteboard, again, a facilitator, and each room has a specific discussion prompt. So it's the same idea. It's just the way that you navigate is going to be a little bit different. So participants, you'll be able to self-select the groups you wish to attend and rotate as you wish. Try to spread yourselves out if you can. I'll show you how you can see that in a moment. My suggestion is that you rotate rooms on the quarter hour. This first one will go a little bit, no, it won't go a little bit longer. You'll have about 15 minutes in each room if you want to visit each topic, but you don't have to visit each topic. I'll send a prompt at 10:45, 11, 11:15, and 11:30 in case you want to be moving to each room. Your group members will be changing up frequently throughout this experience, so don't worry too much about formal introductions. The focus can really be on the content. You're welcome to share your name and organization before you share an idea as you wish. Otherwise, you're self-selecting where you want to be and when you want to change rooms. So your group makeup will be shifting a little bit throughout the full, at this point, it'll probably be about 80 minutes. We're trusting that you'll introduce yourselves and come and go as you need to. When you do leave one breakout room and go to another, you'll see the virtual whiteboard that is already populated with ideas of people who have come before you. You'll join the conversation and add entries or elaborate on what you see. This conversation is a little bit like a traffic circle. So cars coming and going as they need at different exits. It's a little bit like that. You're in the circle for as long as that conversation is making sense to you, and then exiting to another group when you need to. So let me put the discussion prompts in the chat so that you have a menu of what's ahead. And facilitators, while I'm doing that, do you have any questions of me about how this will work? I think you're all pretty well primed, but I will note for all of us that it is a bit of an experiment trying out this choose your own direction, choose your own adventure for the next over an hour. So if you run into technical trouble, you can find me back in this room to be a switchboard operator or a troubleshooter or whatever you may need. Okay, everyone, you just got a lengthy chat from me that had a menu of discussion prompts A through E. When you see the breakout rooms, you're going to see them named A, B, C, D, E, and the facilitator name next to it, with a couple keywords about the discussion prompt. And I hope that's enough to help you find out where you want to go. Participants, do you have any questions of me? Once you're in the small groups, I do encourage you to turn on your cameras so that you can see each other. If you're able to do that in a space where you can do that. If not, that's okay. Breakout rooms are going to be open now if you're all set to try this out. In terms of time, I'll send you 15-minute notes and we'll come back to this larger group break at 11:15 and back to larger group at 11:55. Are you ready to adventure? Okay, rooms are open. You can join a room by self-selecting that discussion prompt you'd like, and then there should be a little blue join button, or it might look like a number on the right-hand side. Click on it and you'll enter that room. If you need help, let me know. It truly does take a village, and I appreciate everyone who gives me the little tips like, please remember to start the recording again. So it's a good reminder for me and for everybody. The meeting has now resumed again and the recording has resumed again. For a round of synthesis and takeaways, and for those of you who have been with the Learning Collaborative and this is your 4th session this year, this is going to be a lot to synthesize. Krista, your topic, like you said earlier, we could have met so many more times for so many more hours and still not barely covered everything that needs to be covered. Let's do this. I'd like to invite, we'll go board by board, about 5 minutes per board. And I'd like to invite the facilitator to tell us the story about what happened in that room, but in only 2 or 3 sentences. I know that's really hard. just because we want to know about what happened there briefly. And then Krista, if you have takeaways, things you're appreciating, or maybe things that you might want to encourage this group to look at or research or consider, I think we'd really love that insight and input. If time allows, we'll go to some questions. For all of you who are staring at the Zoom screen, I think those whiteboards are going to be hard for you to see. So I'm going to go ahead and, while people are talking, pull it up on my screen and attach to the chat a PDF so that you could download and see your own document. I think that's the best way that we can work this through. I tried to share the link with you, but it would not work except if you all logged in. And I don't think you can do that, unfortunately. So where shall we begin? Should we go in order, Krista, and start with what does it look like when a community is doing well at trauma-informed work? Okay, you'll have to unmute. And Destiny, if you could join us at the virtual podium, turn on your camera, that would be great too.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, that's great.
Okay.
I'll pull up your whiteboard while you're talking.
Okay. Good luck with that, by the way.
Yeah.
I just want to be clear what I'm about to reflect on is my perspective of what I think may have happened over time in that space and my observations. And I think to start, it was a little bit difficult, I think, for people to get grounded in what a trauma-informed community could look like, because folks, I think, in some regards are feeling very much like the communities in which they are working in may not be trauma-informed. Or at least there was some observation to that. And then, so that sort of stymied a little bit of the, what could it look like? And so it took us a little while to get excited. And sometimes that start, it was taking the reflection of what's not working well and reframing it to say, well, what would it look like if it was working well? So that got some juice going. And by the time, we sort of ended the conversation, we were really blue skies, rainbows, and talking about how do we incentivize the world and put these points back into a bucket that other people that needed them could pull them down. Like it was amazing. So overall, I wanted to just thank the people that joined me in that space and building energy over time. So did that capture what you were hoping to get at, Jen?
Oh, I don't have specific hopes about it. I think there's going to be this tug and pull between everyone wanting to know what happened when they weren't in the room and just the shortness of time.
Yep.
So you'll do the best you can.
All right, that's what I got.
Krista, you were able to bounce around between different rooms. Did you have?
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
If it's good with you, maybe I'll just say one sentence about each board, or maybe two, and then some overarching things at the end. I thought that this board was terrific and super interesting and raised some critical issues around accountability and looking at systems as a whole. So I thought it was wonderful. I do wonder about whether it's helpful to have goals, to come together as a community and have goals and definition around what do we mean here when we say trauma informed. So I think it's just an echo of what Destiny just said.
So if you were to make a note, you're just wondering, would you repeat that for me?
Yeah, would it be helpful? Is it good to bring the community together in some way to establish some goals around what is trauma informed for us in this place doing this work?
And you'd like to save some time at the end for some more wraparound comments to see them as a whole?
Yeah, if that works.
Yep, we can do that. Well, so let's, in the interest of time, then we'll do that for all the questions and see how much time we have towards the end. And we'll take the next board. And Devin, that's yours around how do we ensure that people with lived experiences are welcomed as leaders, fully participating members, and co-creators of a trauma-informed community? So briefly, what happened in your room?
Again, this is my reflection of what I'm taking away from this meeting. There was a lot of discussion on how do we empower those with lived experience to feel comfortable in sharing their story, if I had to put it in a sentence.
Mhm.
And how do we support them, in their current living situations to be able to attend those meetings or those collaborations or those committees. That was a lot of the discussion. And also just recognizing a lot of the historical things that our community has done that has inhibited or diminished trust between those with lived experience and the organizational work.
Mhm. Krista, did you have takeaways when you looked at the Post-its or were able to maybe listen in on some of that conversation?
Yeah, I spent some time in that room, and I just want to amplify that this is a really hard piece of the work. This is a really difficult piece of the work for a variety of reasons. And most of us are, fluent in being at the table. Most of us who are here today are fluent in how do you be at the table and participate in leadership conversations, etc. And that is not something that's familiar to everyone. And so it is very challenging to figure out how to do that. I just want to also highlight that this issue around telling stories, that's a critical skill that many of us take for granted. But if you come from a very chaotic environment, telling a cohesive story is very hard. And so there are lots of skills that came up in this group, and helping people develop skills is really hard. And I think the other side of that challenge for us to think about is, do our systems need to do some work changing the skills that we require of others in order to participate?
This is so interesting. I have so many tabs open that my computer's gotten slower. But I think I'm going to try to capture that last question that you just raised, Krista, which is, it's about, do communities change or do these councils or committees change the expectations or what they...
What skills are required in order to participate? We change those norms.
Skills is a word I'm kind of getting stuck on, but norms isn't quite the word either, but. So I saw that there was at least one of you who raised a hand, and I think my default here is to wait till and batch all those questions towards the very end with all of the boards so that you get a chance to get to each one.
Okay.
Krista, did you have anything else you wanted to add to this?
No, thank you.
So the next board was about, Chris, this is yours, and there are a lot of arrows on your board. How might we co-create outcome indicators and measures across organizational silos and work together to see if our collective efforts are leading us towards those outcomes? So in a couple of sentences, what happened in your room?
The arrows tell the story, I think. Ultimately, what we found was the intersectionality of defining the problem, of what we want to measure, and going back and really the connection to these other groups' whiteboards, which is this part that I highlighted in the green squiggly up here. So we need to have more community involvement in defining what we're trying to measure. And that might look like a community vision for trauma-informed care or trauma-informed community. And that might require input from lots and lots of people and from data. Themes that came up for me included what I mean by themes that came up for me as I was writing them down included maybe leveling the hierarchy and including more voices at the table. I think that idea Krista mentioned around people being fluent in the language that they need to have in order to sit at the table and participate. all of those things really were part of it for us, and the focus being, we've got to know what we want to measure before we can decide how we're going to measure how well we're doing it, and that there didn't seem to be good consensus on that.
And to be honest, reaching consensus on many things would be really hard in this, with a diverse topic in a short frame of time, which is why, Krista, I really appreciated when you said one of your takeaways is this is iterative work. Becoming trauma informed is an iterative process, right? Did you have things, Krista, that you wanted to highlight here?
I thought this group did a great job, and I would just say that one thing that I didn't see on this board that might be helpful, given how complex this question is thinking in terms of short, medium, and long-term goals, and measuring for short, medium, and long-term goals. And I think this wonderful board also raises the question of who is going to collect, track, analyze, and make accessible to the public the data.
The data. Great, thank you. So that brings us to the question that was this, Denise, this was your room. So thinking back to this morning's large group comments about how you think about community, and I think you spoke very briefly about this. You might have more to add, Krista, about getting, barriers to getting candid input from the community to inform our systems. Denise, your question was about building reliable, consistent feedback loops in and around our region. What's the story from your room, briefly?
So the story from our room really started with, I think, more problem statements and more questions than answers. So on the left side of the board, we had yellow stickies that showcase the questions that we were asking, specifically around the things that really came up was about invitation and inclusion, as well as language, the language that we're using. Also the disconnect between being invited and not attending, that people can't or are unable to provide feedback for multiple reasons, is what we talked about. And then over on the right, you'll see all these blue stickies. And really, these were sort of ways that we were starting to think about how to change that narrative, how to change the narrative that we don't have reliable, consistent feedback loops in our region. And I wasn't able to bucket all of these, but if I had to, I would say one is in information sharing, getting information out quicker with more consistency. I would say incentives was another way to get people to participate and provide feedback. A third was changing the way that we're currently doing meetings and when we're hosting them, where we might be looking for feedback from people. They tend to be at dinner time. And so is there a way to maybe do more with employer buy-in or hybrid meetings, and really changing kind of that narrative around civic engagement? And then I think the other one, and this I think kind of crosses over to one of the other groups, is really the language and the onboarding of community members into decision-making groups, right? Like, so for those of us that get paid to attend meetings and have a culture around doing this work, how do we, again, get to that inclusion and not just invitation, to make sure that if we are looking for feedback, that we're able to have community members provide that feedback in an inclusive way. And really trust was the big thing, is how do we also not extract data without reciprocating, right? That's a really big thing. So we have reciprocal relationship on there as well, to make sure, so that we're not the the parents that don't come back with the art supplies. Because that's really where so that was the other thing, is that reciprocal relation, to reciprocate and not just extract information.
Krista,
It was
what
a
would you
great,
add?
great conversation.
Well, it's difficult to add much to that.
Yes.
I do think one of the challenges in this area, in this building trust, and I think it's really important to remember that's a two-way street, right? We want folks to trust us, but I think we also need to be checking in on how much do we actually trust the input and feedback of the others, and that we're asking, and are we privileging any particular kind of information or any particular population's information? And how's our trust in how am I doing on my trust in you?
My computer won't keep up with your thoughts, but I'll catch up with you shortly.
And I was worried about the interpreters.
Keeping up with you, it's the computers. Can someone help me out with spelling privilege?
Yeah. We all know that's a hard word.
It is. I have hard times. Well,
Privilege. L-E-G-E.
No D.
Got it. No D.
Thank
I
you.
want to put a D there, but I don't think you do.
I want to do all kinds of creative things with spelling. All right. So, Krista, would you have anything else to add to this, or should we move to the next?
Let's go to the next.
Yeah. Okay. So that would be, oh, Melinda, this is yours. How can we sustain patience and persistence at the same time over time?
I thought the irony of me getting one that includes the word patience when I am always so eager to make things happen yesterday for those who are vulnerable. I have to say a common theme that came up from people who were in and out of the group was this hyper focus on self-care and healing. And I loved that, because, you know, there's that saying, hurting people hurt people, right? So people who are hurting end up hurting other people. And then people who are healed like to help heal other people. So I think that we really did a focus on our own personal self-care, balance, our relationships with each other, right? With our coworkers and our community partners. So that can be translated to also the vulnerable people that we're serving. If we are not well balanced in ourselves and within our organizations, trying to deliver quality to people that are looking for support is really challenging to do. So that would be one of the points that came up regularly about that self-care balance, you know, being aware of our own trauma, secondary trauma. The other thing that came out of it was, well, of course, there's, you know, snacks and food, because Heather Simkin and I were in the same room at the same time. So we had to put snacks and food up there. But then also looking at the fact that great change often is a process. It's not an event. So remembering that when we do have that kind of impatience, like we've been talking about the same thing, you know, not just month after month, but year after year, where it feels like, can we stop having conversations and can we get stuff done? And yet we also have to remember that those goals that we set must be realistic to have that tangible proof that we're going the right direction, right? The tangible evidence that there is in fact positive change, because it's all part of a process, not an event. So there was a big focus on that process piece and knowing that patience comes with process change, and then also on the self-care piece, so we can trust ourselves that we're communicating in a way that's healthy with others, and that we are able to have, you know, love, not the emotion, but the action of that lifestyle of love with our partners and the people that we're sharing, the patients, the clients. So we can trust that what we're doing is appropriate because we're well balanced and able to do a deep enough self-assessment, organizational assessment, and therefore deliver quality service.
Krista, would you have anything to add to that or to this board?
Just a couple things. The first of all, I love this board, and I'm sure that it's the kindness, the Vermont kindness on this board that is able to give us Ben and Jerry's and maple sugar candy. Celebrating wins. The thing that I don't know about the rest of you, but the task-oriented folks like celebrating the little wins and situating them in the bigger goals. And the flip side of that, normalizing failures, because every failure is just an opportunity to learn. Like, I think we should probably ban the word failure, but moving to that learning focus where we're learning from everything that we do.
So we have a couple of minutes, Krista. You said that you had some trends you wanted to share. If there's time, I want to give some takeaways for folks who are in the participant audience. I don't know how much time we'll have. It's right now 12:17. But Krista, let's start with what's top of mind, the kinds of overarching themes you wanted to reinforce.
Okay, so the first thing is I just want to reflect back to you that there's so much good stuff happening. I knew that there was good stuff happening in your community with these learning collaboratives and the work that you're doing on the ground. And I think it showed up everywhere in your questions, in your discussions, and on your whiteboard. I noticed that there are obviously really incredible people, but a huge range of amazing skills that people were, at least in the rooms where I dropped in, people were willing to tell stories about the skills that they have and that they employ. And I think more and more of those conversations will help us learn from each other and also maybe borrow what other people are doing. So I thought that was wonderful. I noticed that there was so much care for both clients and care providers. That last little bit about self-care, I think, is one example of that. I love that there was emphasis, especially in the measurement group, but in other places, on goals. And I think that finding cohesiveness, I know we talked a little bit earlier about how difficult it is to get started and all of those kinds of things. This idea of coming together to set some goals and having those goals be measurable and realistic, and maybe we could break them into short, medium, and long term together. And that is an awesome way to get started, right? We can do what's in front of us and get started there. I wanted to add, because this issue of welcoming came up, is that there is a huge amount of power in welcoming when people feel welcomed. I just finished a study that's not public yet, but I will tell you one of the punchlines is that when people with lived experience feel genuinely welcomed to the table, it helps to drive other parts of that self-healing community model in amazing ways. So it was lovely to see that conversation, and I'd love to know that you're going to have more of it. Just a shout out to the measurement group and the reminder that what gets measured gets done. So I think there's a bunch of really wonderful stuff here. And just a couple of things to think about moving forward. The first is that I shouldn't say still, that's not a good word. I am hearing a strong emphasis on client kinds of relationships, where we're talking about individual cases. If you look at the stickies, you see a lot of language. It's about they and them. And I think that's function of thinking about providing care to specific individuals that need it. And I think moving forward with a self-healing communities kind of framework, we need to begin to think about us as a population and community as a whole. And it's a very significant mind shift. It's a very significant shift in values and thinking. So I saw some of that emerging, and it's definitely a developmental process. And the second thing is just remembering, and Chris really, I think, called this out in the last Q&A, that our systems sometimes really define who we are and how we see ourselves, and we don't even know it. So I would just say, someone recently said this to me, and I'll just share it with you, and that is that we can't self-care our way out of broken or oppressive systems. So some of the challenges in front of us really have to do with being able to look at systems as a whole, learn more about systems dynamics, and make a bigger space there for ourselves collectively. And I'll just leave you with the wisdom of Otto Scharmer, who says, even when the systems are very oppressive, if we just keep adding people to our conversations and hearing their truths, that we will eventually see how it is that we have collectively co-constructed our current reality, which opens the door for innovating our way out of our current reality. And also, thank you for letting me come. I love Vermont.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I had to let some quiet there for a moment because that's a big quote, Krista, at the end of the day. It's a lot to integrate with.
And can we write that down somewhere?
You might be able to cut and paste it. So participants, to everyone who's here today, I am going to move to closing comments, but if you're sitting on a comment or a question that you wanted in the mix, my invitation to you is to put it into the chat, because we'll still be together for a little over 5 minutes or so, and people will get to have eyes on what you were thinking. I am making a transition now to Denise, and that's because I think there's a number of next steps to talk about. Am I right on that?
I did see that Morgan Lanfear had his hand up, and I just want to make sure we're not missing a comment from you, Morgan.
And Morgan, we might be. I can make some time for that, Denise, but here's my assumption. Even beyond Morgan, if people didn't put their hand up, I think there's probably lots of comments out there, and we won't have time for all of them.
Okay.
Morgan, is there something that you would like to share on air?
I mean, no, I just quickly, the only two things that popped up, like one was with the data, and I think that was letter C. I know one thing that comes up in communities is not just the collection process, like, you know, how that's managed, but also like we were saying, like who owns the data, and then also like, do we ask permission and do we explain how we're going to use it and for what? So that's a little bit of a, like, you know, one area just to think about. And then the only other thing was on the B, there's, and I've noticed it in Vermont and in a lot of different organizations, but there is like a past stigma where it is almost an affront to your organization or sometimes your culture, your community, to take funding or to receive money for some of these things. And a lot of folks have been volunteering for a long time doing some of these things. And so there's like the volunteerism versus sacrifice. There's like a little bit of tension in there, you know, as we try to move into more of a sustainable and, you know, workable model in that. And so for folks to just be super aware of the sensitivity, like even I've seen people who needed it and were counting on money, when they send out an email just to get information from people backed out, you know, just because it's a hard topic to talk about. So people are usually uncomfortable with it. And so we can look at options for like, hey, we have to do this as our policy. We have to compensate you just like we would anybody. You can do with it what you want, donate it back to your community, take it. That's once we get it to you, it's up to you. And then that takes kind of some of the stigma off. But there is just a nuance of that at the end where you want to almost not give them the option to feel shame or guilt about that. That's it. Go
Yeah,
ahead. Sorry.
it's okay. I'm going to take that word nuance that you just used and underscore that there are so many nuances to be carried forward, and it's in reinforcing and meeting over time in an iterative way where the community really gets to sink into some of those pieces, expand competencies and literacy with the tensions people are noticing and surfing every day. So to that end, I'm going to use your comments, Morgan, about that were very specific and nuanced. And I think there's probably hundreds of observations like that across even just these 5 boards. And Bridget, back to you, Denise, so that we can summarize what people can expect from today, but then also where this conversation goes next.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Krista, I just want to thank you again for what a wonderful morning. I'm so grateful that we were able to find you and connect. And